Get started.
Phil? Phil?
Okay, I think we're ready, right? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Clee Jackson, the president of the Greater Grand Rapids NAACP branch here. I want to thank everyone who was here, to their surveillance technology policy. I offer my sincere thanks to the entire leadership team from the city of Grand Rapids, including Mayor Bliss, City Manager Mark Washington, Attorney Brandon Davis with the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, City Attorney Anita Hitchcock, Chief Eric Payne, Fire Chief John Lehman, and all of the city commissioners, especially the Third Ward commissioners, Sunita Lanier and Commissioner Nathaniel Moody, for their support throughout this process. Additionally, I really want to thank our community partners at the ACLU of Michigan, Link Up, the Urban Core Collective. The ACLU is actually the organization that fought hard for the initial surveillance technology policy many years ago and provided the original template. We are confident that this revised policy provides additional protections as well as accountability to the citizens of Grand Rapids. This is, and I cannot say this enough, this is a great example of how an effective public-private partnership should work. We've been lobbying the city of Grand Rapids officials to make significant changes, what we consider significant changes to this policy for almost over a year, actually, because we know preventative measures like this, it saves lives and it protects the civil liberties and civil rights for those who might be impacted by the use and deployment of surveillance technology, and especially those residents in the Third Ward, who we believe will be disproportionately impacted by the use and deployment of various technological tools to address the issue of crime. We know these types of technologies, like the deployment of helicopters over the past year in the Third Ward, to ask at this point Carlton Mayers to come up. Carlton is one of our legal advisors and counsel for the Greater Grand Rapids branch of the NAACP. And I want to ask Carlton to kind of speak to some of the revisions in the policy and the impact that this will not only have here locally, but nationally as well. And after Carlton makes his brief remarks, I'm going to ask Mayor Bliss to come up and make some comments, and then following her, City Manager Mark Washington. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, and hello. My name is Carlton T. Mayers II, Esquire, and I am the Special Advisor on Public Safety for NAACP Greater Grand Rapids branch. I also did a lot of work with NAACP in the city on the amendments to the administrative policy for the city of Grand Rapids on surveillance equipment and surveillance services for both acquisition and use. So I just want to put out there, number one, I want to echo what President Jackson just said. This is a wonderful example, not only of the process for including community members in what law enforcement and elected and appointed government officials are doing around public safety, because as we all know, community members are also stakeholders in public safety. So it's great to have everybody coming together to do that. Another reason why this is also a wonderful example of that model is the actual policy itself. The substance of it is reflective of that kind of collaboration. So for instance, there are certain provisions within the policy that, in my opinion, empower community members to be more involved in the decision-making process as it relates to the acquisition, purchase, surveillance, use, and deployment of these technologies and services. One example is the creation of the Surveillance Oversight Committee, which is going to be in the form of the existing Public Safety Committee. Another example are the mandatory public hearings that have to happen on the front end when the technology is being purchased or acquired, and also on the back end after the technology has been used, all of which now allow community members to be more hands-on, more involved in the implementation of this policy. Another thing to keep note of is that there's also accountability mechanisms written into this amended policy that did not exist before. For instance, now you have a complaint process that is detailed in the policy, which is phenomenal. You also have the power of the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability that now has a specific role relating to complaints from civilians and just in general doing an audit of the implementation of this policy and surveillance technologies over at least a quarterly basis, so that's a big deal. And then lastly, there's also a surveillance after action report that will be published annually, so all members of the community will have access to it. It does a great job at not only outlining the impact that the use of the technology has had on violating civil liberties and civil rights broken down by race, gender, age, and also location, but most importantly, it also provides data on complaints about the surveillance use, also broken down by race, gender, age, and location, which is huge, mainly because two reasons. Number one, most cities, most municipalities in America, in the US, do not have a policy like this or an ordinance that governs surveillance technology and use of it. A good example, you look at Detroit, Michigan, they're currently advocates for trying to get something like this done. They don't have anything on the books. Chicago, same thing. And then cities that do have this kind of policy typically rarely ever mention explicitly race and any data related to race. For instance, like I mentioned, the complaints about the surveillance use being broken down by race. You look at New York City, they don't have that within their policy that was enacted this year, their ordinance related to surveillance use. And so this is definitely a bellwether policy for other municipalities that I believe you will see other cities using going forward as a model. So there's a lot to be happy about, a lot to celebrate. However, I do want to emphasize there's still more work to be done. We do look forward to working with the city on, for instance, educating the public on the implementation of this policy and how they can engage on it. And then also on monitoring, implementation, and evaluating it just to know, is it working? If it's not, what do we need to do? And lastly, on revising the Grand Rapids Police Department's youth interaction policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlton. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be joining you today as we highlight and really celebrate this updated surveillance policy. And as Carlton said, it's a policy that has a lot of really important elements around transparency and accountability and oversight and community engagement in the process, among many others. So if you've had a chance to read it, you'll see that significant changes were made to this policy. And I was actually around this table as a city commissioner back in 2015 when this policy was created. And I appreciated the community engagement and really leadership from both the NAACP and ACLU and the ongoing partnership that we've had with them. All of us know that technology has changed quite a bit since 2015 and revisions to this policy were absolutely needed as we look to the future. And we came alongside with our partners again. And so I really can't say thank you enough. On behalf of our entire commission, I'm glad to be here. I'm joined by Commissioner Jones, but I speak for our entire commission when I say thank you. Personally, I want to say thank you to Clee and his leadership, and to Carlton, to ACLU, to our Chief Payne, and Phil in the attorney's office, and Chief Lehman, the entire department, and Brandon Davis, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. They have worked on this policy for well over a year to bring forward the recommended changes that we are going to be adopting soon. And I believe even beyond that this updated policy, and more so the process that we went through, is an example of the power of working in partnership with community, the community coming together with city staff and policymakers for the benefit of everyone in the city. We all love this community, and we have more that bring us together than tear us apart. And this, to me, is an example of identifying those shared priorities and shared solutions. You know, when we come together around the table and we truly take time to listen, to engage, to work through a difference of opinion, maybe opinions, and really collaborate and stick with it, amazing things can happen and everyone can win. And that's where meaningful long-term change can happen. Truly, I believe now more than ever, we need to find ways to bring people together and to work together. We have challenges in our community, and the wisdom lies in partnering with community to find the solutions. We need to build relationships. I think this is a great example of building ongoing relationships. And we need to bring people together to be a part of the process. And this process was an example of just that. So I want to personally thank everyone who was involved, everyone who gave their time and their energy and their talent to getting us here today, all of the city staff that worked on it, and one of them that I am most grateful for, who is a partner on this commission, but also a leader of our city, and that is Mr. Mark Washington. So I'll now turn the podium over to our city manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, everyone. I too am so grateful for the partnership with the NAACP, President Jackson, Attorney Myers, and all the members who are here today, along with city staff who are flanking us this afternoon from every department that's been mentioned. This is an example of a value of collaboration, but also when it's community driven and community inspired. And I want to thank President Jackson for his persistent pushing us to really evaluate our policy and really push us really to the point of discomfort, to where we had to ask, were we doing everything we could to be transparent? Because the goal of our police department is ultimately to build trust with our community. In order to do that, you have to have a high level of transparency and accountability. And I think, as you heard Attorney Myers talk before about it being a very open procurement process, one that is publicly discussed. We clarified a lot of definitions in the policy that was really legalese and really allowed it to have more of a lay meaning for the public and anyone who is able to read it. And I celebrate this because a couple of months or not long ago, we announced another community partnership with the Urban League on violence interruption. And so this fall has just been very important to us, particularly as we began to search for the next chief of our department, for them to know the kind of culture that we have in this community, that it's one that partners with community, and one that I'm proud to say, after hearing the remarks from the NAACP, that sets the example for other cities and other communities in the world, how community policing or neighborhood policing can work in partnering with communities. So thank you all so very much for being here today.
So at this time, we're going to open it up for questions from the media if you guys have any. But I also want to lastly acknowledge our staff from the NAACP, as well as our executive officer, Gail Harvey, Manager of Policy, Ahmad Hardy, and Kareem Scales, Administrator of Operations. They put in a ton of work on this. And actually, you said, Mark, I was pushing you, but they were pushing me. So it goes both ways. So we'll open it up for any questions that the media might have.
Talk a little bit about some of the disproportionate ways this might impact Ward 3 and people living there. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so important for you guys to have this kind of policy in place to protect people there?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at surveillance technology and devices that are used across the country, I mean, let's be honest, we know that typically Black and brown people and poor and white folks are disproportionately impacted. And I think a lot of the narrative or the argument to justify that would be the crime stats, right? In certain wards, neighborhoods, communities. And so, again, as I said earlier, it is critically important that we be preventive instead of reactionary. And I think that's what this policy does, by allowing that community voice to be at the front and to be centered and to hold folks accountable, quite honestly. I think this policy not only is a protection for civilians, but also for law enforcement agents as well. And so that's what I would say. I don't know, Carlson, if you have anything to add to that, or.
Only thing I would add is that the best way to see the amendments that are now in the revised administrative policy are essentially just bolstering the quality control mechanisms that are already in place and then creating other ones to make it even stronger. Like I mentioned, that after action report, I think that's going to be key. And I'm sure the news media would be interested in it once it's published on an annual basis to see the technology was used in this year, what was the impact. And it also actually provides information on the fiscal impact as well, not only on impact on race, gender, age. And so to have that information will, for the future, help law enforcement, city staff, and community be able to come together and say, okay, was this a good use of these funds and this technology? How do we have to change it so that it's more effective, so on and so forth. So that's all strengthening and establishing quality control mechanisms.
There are, I think, 11 changes, within this new proposed policy. I guess, what do you, of the 11, which do you think are most impactful to people living within the city of Grand Rapids? Why should they care about these 11 changes that are being proposed?
Well, they should care about all of them, but you can come back, Carlton, and address that if you would, or the city manager as well.
Yeah, I certainly, I think for many reasons, as already been enumerated, but I think in terms of, there are concerns about privacy. And people want to have their privacy protected, but there's also the concern about, making sure that the community can be safe. And, policing in this era, we're in a technological age, and it's hard to have a conversation around any city service without the use of technology. So citizens should be assured that when we buy technology, that it won't be overly invasive and infringe upon their human and civil rights. And we're trying to be as transparent as possible in the acquisition and deployment of it to make sure that there's good community engagement, awareness from the public before our policymakers ultimately make a decision to vote on it.
And then can you just describe, you guys say surveillance technology, but what is some surveillance technology that the city is currently using, and then, maybe some passports that have been proposed but not necessarily
Right.
approved?
I'm going to maybe defer to some of the operations, but body cameras, for example, is one that's important. And right now, I'm just be candid, we have an critical incident in the city, and what's going to help us is the use of technology as to investigate some of the origins around what occurred. And so that as I think President Jackson mentioned before, not only protects the citizens, but also the officers involved. So in that instance, it's a source of information, a source of truth. But there's other technology that we use, for example, in responding to critical incidents on fire or flooding in the river. The fire department has used several times aerial drones in the past. And Chief, you want to talk about how that's deployed?
So the main thing that the fire department would use as far as this policy would cover would be our drone program. And so we are able to utilize that to assess building damage. We're able to do assessments after a significant, severe weather event. We're able to use our FLIR technology to be able to locate a image of somebody that may be in the river or be able to keep accountability during a nighttime event. And so those are the areas that the fire department operates.
And I'll defer one to the police department, but we discussed before about using aerial response in terms of having similar drones in the police department to respond quicker without navigating through traffic. We've had a lot of incidents, complaints about high-speed motorcycle incidents, and the departments choose not to pursue to endanger lives, but aerial drones would allow them to do it without harming pedestrians. Chief, you want to talk about that?
So drone or UAS technology really can be a force multiplier for us, but also it helps the community out too. That being said, a lot of community says, well, why did you need so many officers? A lot of those officers are on scene so we can have eyes on and keep the community safe and keep the officers safe on scene. With drone technology, we can use that to be able to observe the whole area using fewer cops or having officers out of sight that can respond if needed if we were to pick something up using that technology. The technology that we currently use at the police department is used to keep the public safe. And that's the only reason why it's used. A lot of our technology is used with the bomb team. We have one of the only bomb teams on this side of the state. And we have robots with cameras on them. And that technology works great. Keeps the officers safe, keeps the public safe. The officers don't have to go down on a suspected device if they're able to use that technology. Our special response team, which responds to critical incidents, also uses them, but after they already have a search warrant that's signed by a judge that says that we can use that technology inside a home or a private residence.
And I want to just be real clear as well. Today, we're not authorizing the purchase of any of this type of technology. This is just a process. And so I want to ask Carlton to come back up also, just to talk a little bit about ShotSpotter and what that does and what that means in this space.
Okay, well, I'm sure a lot of you know that there were some efforts, I believe last year, to purchase ShotSpotter. It's a gunshot detection technology that is used to detect with sensors to detect gunshots, and then within like 60 seconds inform law enforcement of the location of where the gunshots were fired. So then law enforcement can respond to the scene, hopefully in enough time, if not to prevent any more further injury, at least to be able to collect evidence to develop a case and then catch whoever the suspects are involved in the incident. Now, that's how it's supposed to be used. However, it is the actuality in how it is used has resulted in actually over-policing of Black and brown communities. Essentially, what's been going on is that I know that President Jackson had mentioned how a lot of times law enforcement use crime data to determine where they're going to target their tactics and their strategy. And that crime data tends to focus on Black and brown communities. However, it does not take into account the underlying issues that result in that outcome. And so at the end of the day, it's just, oh, most of the violent offenders in our community are located in this area, or most of the violent offenses occur in this area. So that's where they target. And the sensors are placed in those locations. And so that could be like a public housing authority, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. And so like the Third Ward, those kinds of zip codes. So the problem is that if the sensors are there, anytime a gunshot goes off, it's going to be in that location. Law enforcement is going to constantly be showing up to that location. And that's what results in the over-policing of those communities and ultimately, potentially, into the tragedy or tragic deaths of unnecessary tragic deaths. We saw that this year in Chicago with the Adam Toledo incident. 13-year-old Latino boy was shot by law enforcement. Why? Because law enforcement thought he had a gun. Why did they think he had a gun? Because in their mind, all they knew is that shots were fired in that area. They had no other context. They didn't know it was a couple of teenagers or kids playing with a gun or gang members trying to kill each other. So when law enforcement show up, in their mind, they think I might have to use deadly force. Certain things might happen. Some information may not get in those kind of situations. Next thing you know, somebody's dead when they didn't need to be. So how do we prevent that from happening? By using the data, right? I know Chicago's Inspector General's office recently published a report about 2 or 3 months ago on ShotSpotter, essentially saying that looking at the data, ShotSpotter is not effective at addressing gun violence. However, it does increase over-policing of specific communities, like I mentioned, Black and brown. So just knowing the data, it makes sense to not invest in that kind of technology. Or if you are going to invest in it, to put the proper kind of safeguards in place to prevent those kinds of tragedies from happening. So that's what this policy does essentially. It, like what Clee said, it allows all of the stakeholders to come together and proactively rather than reactively strategize, collaborate, and decide, are we going to do this? How are we going to do it? And then after we do it, we're going to evaluate it and look at what happened and then determine if we're still going to do it going further and how we're going to do it at that point. Like I said, solid quality control mechanisms and allowing community members to be a part of that in a substantive way. That's what this does. And I think that we're going to see more of this in more cities across the country because the federal government has not done anything on policing reform as of yet. So it's up to states and localities to now keep on moving the ball forward on policing reform. So I think this is a great example of what that's going to look like going further.
For clarity, and maybe someone from the city would have to answer this. Now that you have these amendments going in place in January, is ShotSpotter something that's still on the table?
I think the police department is going to have to take this policy as part of their engagement plan and look at their adoptive needs. As we last discussed, the pursuit of technology, the next acquisition of technology was not ShotSpotter, it was aerial support for the drone. So I think we've reevaluated and prioritized that more than the ShotSpotter technology based on the last engagement we had with the public and the commission.
One more question, not necessarily for.
We've already pronounced the benediction. It's it.
I was going to ask, why now? Why is this conversation happening now? Why is this amendment taking place now? I know the ACLU had something in place for years to come, but why are we doing this currently?
And I would say, why not now, right? I think there's been a lot of conversation across the country, including right here locally in the state of Michigan about the purchase and use of this technology. So I think the most important thing is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a preventative measure, and it's about making sure that the civil liberties, I think the city manager mentioned this, as well as civil rights are protected. And so I think it is critically important. And we are super excited to be at this stage. And so we look forward to continuing our partnership with the city and city leadership and looking at other policies as well. I want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank the media for coming. Thank everyone who's looking and watching online. Stay tuned. We'll be doing some educational sessions and some meetings throughout the community, making sure that residents understand the impact of this policy on them directly. And so we look forward to doing that work. Thank you guys for coming.